All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about museum ethics, governance, and legal issues. So here I lay out the objectives related to that. So we're going to talk about museum governance, and by that I mean, and we've mentioned this a few times, but we're talking about who's in charge in the government and what the roles are of the museum authorities, the governing authorities. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Now, this falls under a huge realm of legal issues, and it's quite a big field to actually talk about all of the laws pertaining to museums. But we're going to cover a little bit of that today. We'll talk a little bit about the ethics of museum work, some of which we've already touched on, but we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. And then I'm only going to touch on a few of the specific sorts of legal issues that may come up with respect to museum work. Often these are going to be specific, some of them will be specific to particular collection types, but other of the issues pertain to all museums. So we're going to touch on a few of those details. I put a quote here. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is on your syllabus as well, from Terry Tempest Williams, who said, "Museums are great places to be quietly subversive on behalf of social change." And you'll find that most people don't even realize that they're being subversive in any way when they're working in museums. But in fact, they can very often be very important movers and shakers with respect to museum change. Okay, despite the fact that it's a little bit out of order, I want to talk about governance first. I think this is a topic that most students are not terribly interested in, but I'd like to point out that in your readings, and be sure and read the chapters for this week carefully, there's a real interesting quote here from Marie Millaro. Marie Millaro, by the way, is the sort of legal reference guide to museum law. So she's written several books on museum law. In fact, sort of what's considered the Bible of museum law is this. So, a legal primer on managing museum collections by Marie Millaro. She's actually getting up there in years now. She's at the Smithsonian Institution, but she is this is the Bible when it comes to museum law. So, I highly recommend getting a copy of this. She's actually written another book with a former student of hers and another lawyer, Millaro and DeAngelis. So this is a legal primer on managing museum collections. This is the third edition. The previous one was the second edition, but it's a slightly different book. But this is a great book to read. It's quite easy to read. It has some great case studies in it. And I took an online class in legal issues in museums using this book, and actually not led by Millaro, led by someone else. And I was a little scared about, what this was going to be like, reading a bunch of legal documents. How boring could it be? This is actually a great read of a book. I highly recommend it. There are also some other books that are often referred to in the museum world. So Marilyn Phelan has written several books. This is also considered an important reference book. This is Museum Law, a guide for officers, directors, and counsel. I highly recommend this as well for anyone that's going to go into the administration. But even if you're not, you should be very familiar with the legal issues. But what I wanted to point out was there's a quote here from Marie Millaro in chapter 4. And at the very top it says, a chapter on governance? Perhaps I can skip this for now. I'm not really planning on starting at the top. And she says, please do not turn the page. No matter what professional position you aspire to in a museum, and even if you were only at the entry level, your ability to function effectively is greatly enhanced by a knowledge of museum governance. This is for two reasons. First, museums are truly team operations, and that's one of the reasons I have you guys working in groups, because it really is a team operation. While each professional staff member may have a unique role, all ultimately shape the core educational work of the museum. This interdependence underscores the need for good lines of communication and clear delegations of responsibilities. Neither can come about without an appreciation of governance principles. Second, with an understanding of museum governance, you gain a much better perspective of the role of museums, and this perspective, in turn, sets the proper tone for the day-to-day activities within a museum. A knowledge of the basic governance principles can be the glue that strengthens all human effort within a museum. And I agree with her completely. If you have a greater understanding of how the museum works from top to bottom, it actually makes you a much more effective employee within the museum. Okay, so when we talk about museum governance, what do we mean? So generally speaking, hopefully it looks like my computer has locked up. Let's see what it's going to do. Fascinating. Let's see if I can back up now. You really got to love it when this happens when you're actually recording. Okay. So, by museum governance, I mean those who govern, or there's a quote from your book that says, those who govern make policy. Those who administer carry out the policy. So generally speaking, we're talking about, with museum governance, we're talking about the very top echelon. So who's actually making the decisions and then who's enforcing those decisions. So when we talk about the museum governing authority, generally we're referring to the board of trustees and the director or directors, depending on how big your institution is. Now the chief administrator is the director. Okay, so what that really means then is that, before I go into this, what that really means then is that the board of trustees are the ones that are actually supposed to be coming up with the policy. So they're the ones that are supposed to be deriving them. And then the director and everyone underneath the director are the ones that are supposed to be carrying out those policies for the museum. So you may not realize this, or maybe you do, but museums run like what are called trusts or trust-like organizations. So if you're not familiar with what a trust is, you can look this up easily on Google or in any of these legal textbooks. They're quite good references, and it's not a lot of heavy reading. But effectively, trusts are entities that are meant to be controlling assets or money, or in the case of museums, artifacts. And they're controlling them, maintaining them in perpetuity for the greater good. Now, who is included in that greater good depends on the kind of entity that you're working in. In the case of a museum, you're holding on to property, artifacts, specimens for the public good. Okay, so you're holding them in trust for the public. So a trustee, property administered for the benefit of others. Okay, so not for the benefit of themselves, but for others. Trustees have a legal authority to control museum assets, and they must further the mission of the museum. So they're the ones that are going to get tapped if there's ever a problem. So ultimately, all the decisions rest with them, and all the actions within the museum rest with them. So they're the supreme beings that are held responsible for everything that happens within a museum. And so they're meant to be acting in the best interest of the mission of the museum, which is, again, for the interest of the public. So ultimately, it all lies on their head. So trustees are usually citizens that are selected to serve. So, and this is regardless of whatever kind of institution. So generally, these are not elected officials. They don't necessarily apply for the job. They're appointed. So they're elected, they can come from a variety of walks of life, but they're appointed to these positions, and they have a very strong legal responsibility to the institution for which they are a trustee. So regardless of whether it's a university, a museum, a charity, a hospital, whatever it is. So that board of trustees sets policy and ensures implementation, and they establish generally a code of ethics. So they're supposed to be overseeing everything that's happening in the museum. So you might ask, like, well, how are board members selected and what are they like? And we touched on this a little bit in class. Generally speaking, regardless of the kind of institution you're looking at, generally speaking, these are, at the university level, they're selected by the governor. In various museums, there might be several different avenues for how they get selected to the board. But when it comes to museums, generally speaking, these people, you try to get representatives of all the different kinds of stakeholders that might be interested in museum work. So, for instance, you might want to have some big rollers in the community that have connections to lots of engaged, wealthy people that are interested in supporting museums. They can serve sort of as a liaison to that realm of life. You might want to have community people that represent different educational levels that play a role. You might want to have educators on your board. You may want to have perhaps former museum members or employees. Maybe they're retired, but they still want to serve the community. And since they have a background in museums, they know a little bit about how they work, so they could be very valuable being on the board. In other words, you're going to have a lot of different kinds of people that can serve a role on the board in hopes of governing the entire institution. Okay. Pardon me. So then the idea is once you actually have the board elected, or not elected, sorry, selected, and they're in place, they make the majority of the decisions in consultation with the director with regular meetings. And then whatever they decide upon, the director is the one that implements those policies. So he or she is the one that brings them back to the museum proper, discusses them with all of the museum employees, and then attempts to ensure that those policies are being enforced. So generally speaking, directors used to be scholarly trained, and I say used to be. That's often still the case now. You do find that most directors that are in museums have scholarly training in the sense of they have an advanced degree and experience in whatever topic is covered by that museum. So you have, well-trained historians that might be directors of historical museums. You have biologists, let's say, that probably hold PhDs that might be directors of natural history museums and so on. But lately, that's not always the case. There has been this increasing trend for directors to come from the business world or the accounting world. And so this is in part because boards have gone in that direction themselves. They have decided that they want a more business-minded person to be in charge because of the concern of fiscal governance. So they're worried that an academic might not be the best choice for knowing how to run the institution from a financial side point. It's unclear to me where this is derived from. I'm not aware of there being a number of museums that have gone bankrupt as a result of an academic being in charge instead of a business person. But this is something that's been happening globally where you find that there's more and more business people in charge. And this is not necessarily a good thing, but that's a topic of discussion that we'll cover in class. So I say here that there's been several experiments with business professionals as directors. Sometimes there are a few instances where, and they mention this in your book, where sometimes there's dual directors. There's like a financial director or a more business-oriented one versus a scholarly one. And they're supposed to work together. But you can imagine that having two people with the same title that are both supposed to be co-directors, if you have two well-selected people that get along, that can work really powerfully. But you can imagine that in more cases than not, most people like to be the boss, and it's hard to share that title. So that isn't always the most effective way to run an institution. That said, there's actually quite a bit of debate in the museum world regarding the best way to govern. And as a result, this is something that's getting covered more and more in museum studies programs, and especially at the advanced levels and in the graduate levels, there are many courses that you're required to take to learn more about museum governance, how it's run, all of the details that you may not realize if you're working in collections regarding how you gain money, how you work with communities, and even our own program here has quite a heavy emphasis on, or now it has a heavier emphasis on governance. So you might think it's boring, but it's actually really important for you to be able to understand, so you understand where those policies are coming from and how they should be implemented. Okay. That's all I'm really going to say about governance, but we're going to discuss this more in class and go over some of your readings. Let's talk now a little bit about museum ethics. So, um, I don't know how often you actually think about ethics, but ethics are supremely important to museums because of their trust-like nature. So trusts, so things like charities and nonprofits, just like museums, their reputation and their credibility is everything. If you lose your credibility, you've just lost your entire institution. Because if people don't trust you and if they don't believe in you and your adherence to your own mission, and if the mission is not well articulated and worthy, you're not going to get donors. You won't have visitors. You won't have members. You're going to lose the entire market for your institution. And I know that that sounds a little bit capitalistic, but I don't mean it necessarily that way. But there is a capitalistic aspect of this from the standpoint of in order for museums to exist and to continue to run, they too need funding. And so they need to have the faith of the public in them in order to be able to continue to run. And so they need to be well governed. So ethics is everything. So the AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, established its first code of ethics in 1925, and that was about 19 years after it was founded, that the organization was founded. So several professionals came together and insisted that yes, we need to lay out some form of ethics that will govern all museums, or at least accredited museums, but hopefully all museums. This is something about the AAM that's really interesting. So the museum world is quite well regulated, and in fact, they're self-regulated. They're actually quite hard on themselves to try to maintain really high standards so that there is no loss of credibility or faith from the public. So this represented this first code of ethics was supposed to represent the philosophical underpinnings of museum work. So why are we doing what we're doing? How are we going to do it? And let's make this as transparent as possible. And so there was a lot of discussion about why do museums do what they do and what's important to them philosophically. It was a very long time until this code of ethics was reviewed. So the second code of ethics was reviewed and established in 1978. In this case, there were some changes, as you might expect, to the document. So the focus was on internal human and collection management concerns. So there were a lot of issues regarding how items were acquired, how they were being handled. So for instance, things like artwork that was stolen during World War II, or illegal looting of culturally significant places around the world, particularly in Greece and Italy, but in other places in Egypt, Middle East. So there was more of a focus on how things were being done in a museum setting. So what is considered right and wrong in the museum world? And it was quite interesting. There was a lot of discussion about what it's okay for museum curators and collections managers, well, curators, what it was okay for the museums to acquire. And there was quite an arrogant attitude from some institutions, particularly in Europe, regarding their desire to acquire artifacts from abroad, often from the Middle East, and to maintain them. They felt like they could do a better job of it than some of those home countries could, and that they didn't deserve to keep their own items of cultural significance because they didn't have the resources to take care of them properly. That's a bit of an arrogant attitude, and it might have been correct, but that doesn't make it right. And we'll talk about more examples of that in class. So this second round was focused on the how. How are things being done? Now, interestingly, while they made a much stronger document in 1978 and beefed it up quite a bit, it basically had no teeth. So there was the absence of a mechanism for implementing the strictures of this particular code of ethics, and as a result, it wasn't very effective. So yeah, it did lay out in strict terms, here's what museums should and should not do. But what happened if you did that anyway? What happened if you regularly took in looted items from Greece? Was there any consequence? No, not really. And so as a result, not all museums adhered to it, and plenty did not. So ICOM, now remember, this is the international arm, so the International Commission on Museums. AAM is the American arm of ICOM. So in 1986, and then later adopted formally by the AAM in 1981, they reviewed the Code of Ethics and said, okay, this is crazy. We have to strengthen this document, and there are several issues that are coming up that we need to address very directly. So in this case, some of the changes that they made included enforcing voluntary adherence to the ethics ethics code, and actually, so enforcement was voluntary, but it was a requirement in order to be a member of the AAM. Now you might ask, like, what's the importance of being a member of AAM? Well, there's several fold, but networking is probably one of the key ones. But I'll go over in class some of the benefits of being a member of AAM. But some of it also includes the ability to acquire grants from them. You must be a member. There are other benefits that we'll go over. So in order to be a member, they were stating that you had to, as a museum institution, you needed to enforce this code, and you need to formally adopt it and show that you were strictly adhering to the code. So if you were found to be in violation of the code, this could be a big problem for you. Now, this was a bit of a problem. So the code was actually suspended 6 months later, and then they fixed part of the documents that had to do with making it a requirement to be a member of AAM to enforce these policies. So they changed the code dealing with the use of funds. So again, we talked in class about how when you sell items from your collections, you can only use those funds for the development of collections. Yeah, that was not a policy prior to 1986. Lots of people sold off collections so that they could spend that money in all kinds of different ways. And so there was no clause in the Code of Ethics governing how those funds could be used. So in 1986, they changed that. And they changed it from an application to collections replenishment to also conservation. So they included other aspects of collections management and development. Okay, now I'm not going to do this here, but we're going to actually go over some of the details of the code, which isn't a very long document. But make sure that you read through the code in Glaser and Zenitooth, or what's better yet is if you go to the AAM website, you can actually log into it, and I'm going to give you my login. You can type in Code of Ethics in the AAM website to see the latest version of the code, and that's what we're going to be going through in class. If you go to the AAM website, my login is a number. My login is 151870. So write that down, 151870. And the password is AAM Herper. So all one word, AAM HERPER. So if you use that login and password, you can actually see the Code of Ethics. And you're going to want to do this because we're going to discuss this more in class. Okay. Now, when it comes to ethics and then combining that with legal issues, there's a withering assortment of concerns. And so if you look at page 57, there is a list, and we're going to go through these in class in 2, but there's a whole range of issues that are of concern to museums. So everything from being able to prove when you actually own an object and when you actually don't have the right documents to show that. There's a whole number of issues pertaining to NAGPRA and Native American issues, who's allowed to have access, who's not allowed to have access. So go through this list and be ready to discuss this in class. All right, so let's talk about some of those legal issues. And again, there's a whole cornucopia of issues in museums, and you can read about this online all the time. There's always articles coming out on this. But let's cover some of the highlights that are of importance to most museums. So one is intellectual property and rights. And we're going to cover a little bit of intellectual property law here. So what's intellectual property? I got a feeling I'm going to have somebody coming in here trying to vacuum my carpet, so bear with. Okay, so intellectual property are the products of human intelligence that are unique and have potential commercial value. And so these are rights that you definitely want to strongly protect and are strictly regulated in the legal code. So this concerns things like ideas. If you have a really good idea, you can patent it and protect it, legally protect it. If you have inventions that might be useful to people, I thought this was a really bizarre invention here. Apparently, it's to keep from splattering stuff all over yourself, I guess. Literary works, of course, clearly, and art works are covered by intellectual property law. And as well as unique names and branding. So you may not think about this, but branding is a huge enterprise for for all sorts of organizations, and is covered under intellectual property rights. So let's talk about four types of intellectual property rights law or IPR law that are relevant and are covered in your readings. The first is copyright, which everyone has heard of, but often seems to be misunderstood, misused all the time. And we're only going to cover a little bit of it here in class and in this lecture. You can read on this ad nauseum, and it seems like these laws are changing all the time. But what is copyright law? Like, what is it covering? So copyright protects original works, whatever kind of work it is, artwork, a book, whatever. Protects original works that exist in tangible form. So this includes literary works, artistic works. I don't have any art in here. Maybe, I don't know. And architectural works. So what copyright law covers then is the right to copy that work, to distribute that work. So you might be able to copy it, but maybe not distribute it. And exhibit protected work for a specific period of time. Okay, so just because you generated that original work doesn't mean you necessarily always have the rights to it, and you don't necessarily have the rights to them indefinitely. So you often want to review copyright law to ensure in the museum world whether, in fact, you have the rights to do all kinds of things. So, for instance, you might be putting on an art exhibition. Okay, so maybe all these pieces of art are produced by one or a few artists, right? So they're the ones that clearly originated the art, right? So, it's their original work. Do they have copyright laws? And again, it's going to depend from person to person. And are they able to, do they have the right, do they own the sole right to copy it, distribute it, and do they have that right for forever? So sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So you need to investigate that always and make sure your rights are covered. The second kind is trademark. So trademarks protect distinctive words, phrases, or designs, or symbols that identify and distinguish specific goods or services. So you see these all the time, these trademarks. So for instance, the little swish from Nike is a protected trademark. Of course, the ever familiar Apple for Apple computers. John Deere is one of my favorite ones. There's all kinds of trademark symbols in this case that are used, that are protected by IPR law. So these are acquired by commercial usage or show bona fide intent to use the mark in commerce. And it also includes things like, yo quiero Taco Bell, or you can come up with all kinds of phrases or distinctive words. Loving it, also protected by McDonald's. Anyway, so that's what trademark law is. Patent law protects inventions, processes, and chemical compositions by granting to the patent holder the right to stop others from making, using, or selling the same thing without permission. So examples that patent law covers are things like all kinds of medications. So of course you're very familiar with going to the store and being able to purchase generics, so-called generics. So what that means is that the patent law has run out on whatever that product is, and other companies can actually produce it. And so here's an example here. Aleve is a product that is meant to help with pain, both headache and muscle pain, and it's naproxen sodium, so that's the actual chemical compound. Well, the patent eventually ran out, and so now there's all kinds of generic versions of Aleve on the market. And this is true for all kinds of medications, but this could be true for other kinds of products as well. Oh, another famous one recently is 23andMe. So this is a company that to which you can send a sample of your saliva. They will survey the genes in your DNA, and mostly they're surveying them for ones of particular interest to health, both mental and physical health, as well as other characteristics. And then they'll report back to you, or they used to be able to report back to you all kinds of details regarding the results of your samples and analysis of your samples. And they used to interpret that in terms of your chances or risks of carrying and or acquiring certain sorts of conditions or diseases. Now, they're not allowed to do that anymore, and we'll talk about that in class. But there are other companies that developed quickly to do the same thing. So just another example of patent and patent law. And then the last is a trade secret. So trade secret law protects information such as formulas, programs, or devices that confer value and competitive advantage in the marketplace. So some examples of this are like the secret ingredients in KFC's spice for making their chicken. There's a lot of different examples. You should see if you can come up with some examples of each of these types of law, and we'll talk about them in class. Okay, now I'm just going to briefly touch on a few specific legal issues, and then we'll end this lecture for this week. So let's talk a little bit more detail about copyright law, because this is a very prominent set of legal concerns for museums as well as other people. So with copyright law, you're normally concerned with, first, who owns the rights to whatever the original work is, and then what all rights do they have. So generally speaking, you're supposed to be able to, if it's your original work, you should be in possession of what's called the bundle of rights. But depending on what those works are and where you live, you don't necessarily have all of the rights that are included in that bundle. So, but if you do, if you own it, you are entitled to the bundle of rights. So that allows you to copy whatever that original work is. You can prepare derivatives of it. You can distribute those derivatives. And then depending on the kind of art or art form it is, you can perform and publicly display that original work. Now, all four of these are included in your bundle of rights. So commit these to memory. The ability to copy it, prepare derivatives of it, distribute it, and perform it. But depending on what the work is or where you live, you may not actually be in ownership of all of these rights. So I say here, however, it might be that each of these rights is independently licensed, so be sure to get them all. So as an example, so there's lots of, so Michael Jackson actually bought the rights to several of the Beatles songs. And so he was able to copy them, make derivatives of them, distribute them, because he purchased those rights and they didn't have them. We'll talk about more examples in class. So generally, copyright law includes provisions for what's referred to as fair use of works. And what that usually means, or how that's generally interpreted, is that there are ways that a copyrighted work can be used without obtaining the permission from the owner. But the key feature is, how is it being used, and are you preventing the owner from getting due credit for that work? And are you preventing them from making a living as a result of using their work? So in other words, if you were to take a book and, I don't know, photocopy it and then pass it out to basically, peddle it on the web or on the street corner or whatever, so that everyone could have a free copy, as opposed to paying for it, and then the person that originally wrote the book, getting royalties from that, well, then that would not be considered fair use. What generally is considered fair use, although this is often debated, is, for instance, how things are used in class. So are you, in fact, allowed to, for instance, take a textbook and photocopy it or scan it and then pass that out to all your students? So generally speaking, if it's used for educational purposes, there is a fair use clause there. but it's completely dependent on how it's used. So, for instance, you can take a book and you can put it on loan or on reserve in the library, and all your students can have access to it and they can all use it. So, they all have a way of going and making their own one personal copy that they can use. So, that's okay. But what you're usually not allowed to do is to then copy it yourself as an instructor and give it to all your students. Now, a lot of people say, like, well, what's the difference? Ultimately, each student is getting a copy of that product, right? Of that, let's say, literature. So, what really is the difference between putting the onus on the student to go copy it versus you copy it for the students as the instructor? What's the difference? It's a great question. Many people consider this to be splitting hairs, but as far as the legal community is concerned, it's not. It's a completely different process. And so one is considered fair use, the other is not. And I put up here, using something in class versus putting it up on Blackboard. It's a similar thing. So could I show it to you in class and you guys could all copy it, maybe take pictures of it, video it, versus, so that could be okay. But if I put it on Blackboard, is that okay? Often it's not. So you always want to be careful when it comes to copyright law. Now, the reality is how often are people prosecuted for violations of copyright law? It happens, not very often. And I'll give you some examples of some things my colleagues do all the time that is in violation of copyright law, but nevertheless, they do it. Okay, so how about application to museums? So if the museum owns those rights, you want to make sure you determine when it expires because you don't necessarily have that bundle of rights for forever. There's usually a statute of limitations. Is it renewable? So often you can renew those rights, but it depends on the particular works that you're talking about and the kind of law. And at some point, often the rights enter the public domain. So when does that happen and what are the details regarding that? So for instance, often in the museum world, we're wanting to use, let's say, videos or images in exhibits that we have clearly seen available on the internet. Well, just because it's on the internet, does that make it okay for you to use? Certainly not. And in fact, most pieces of work will have some kind of a watermark on it, or it'll explicitly say, please ask me for use before using this. And we've all seen people flagrantly disobey that law at their own risk, at their peril, because they could then be sued for using it or reproducing it. So just because you see it on YouTube or on Google Images does not mean that it's in the public domain. And there are actually a lot of programs now that prevent you from being able to do that. So it used to be that you could download videos from YouTube all the time and use them however you want. And people just assumed that if it was on YouTube, that meant it was in the public domain and legal to use, but it's not. And now most of those programs will prevent you. It'll realize that you're trying to download and reproduce a YouTube video and it'll stop you from being able to do it. Now that said, there's a constant arm race with these apps that will allow you to modify YouTube videos. But again, don't do that. Remember, credibility is everything in museums, so you want to make sure that you're covering yourself and that you know all of your legal rights. And frankly, it's not that hard to ask people to use. I've had great success in contacting people, even big organizations like the BBC. I'll see video or PBS. So maybe there's videos that they have that we would like to use, and they often will grant permission. Sometimes you have to purchase a license to use their items, and sometimes it's very pricey. So you may be unwilling to do that. So you might need to seek out another avenue for whatever work it is that you're wanting. But I have found that lots of people are quite generous when it comes to using their materials in a museum setting. Okay, if you don't own it, then you can't renew the copyright. So who can renew it? Well, again, this is going to vary from situation to situation. So you'll want to consult legal counsel regarding when you can renew the right or when you can purchase those rights. We're not going to go into those details in this class. You'll talk more about that if you take the advanced class in museum legal issues. Okay, so what's the duration of the copyright? So generally speaking, most things are covered by the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998, which extends all of the limits by 20 years. Okay, well, what were the original limits? Okay, if the original work was produced prior to 1978, then it enters the public domain in 95 years. So after it's been around for 95 years, it's now considered public domain, and you can copy it, reproduce it, and use it. If it was produced after 1978, and if it's anonymous, so if it's unknown who produced that work, then it enters the public domain 95 years from the first publication or 120 years after creation. Now you might ask, like, what's the difference between first publication and creation? Okay, it depends on the kind of work that you're talking about. Okay, usually, creation and first publication are one and the same. But for instance, you might have a manuscript for a book that an author has completed at some particular time point, but it doesn't actually get published until 30 or 40 years later. So similarly to what's happening with Harper Lee, so the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, she is now about to publish the sequel to that book, but that was a manuscript that was written, decades ago, but it's only just now about to be published. So there's a disconnect between when it was first created and when it's originally published. Okay, so but in this case, I'm talking about something that's anonymous. If it's anonymous, then it enters the public domain 95 years from first publication or 120 years after the creation. Now, if it's not anonymous, if you know who did it, then it doesn't enter the public domain until 70 years after they've passed away. Okay? So if you know who the original person is to produce whatever that piece of work is, then you have to wait until 70 years after they've died. Okay, let's cover a couple of other quick things. So cultural materials and NAGPRA. So we've mentioned this briefly in class, but often you find that cultural materials can be difficult to deal with in a museum setting because they're, of course, very sensitive to a number of people. And so you need to be very careful how objects like that are handled in the museum setting. And usually these days, this is a little bit easier to deal with from the standpoint of now there's such a strict code of ethics that's been produced by ICOM and AAM and is usually well broadcast and well known in the museum world that things are not acquired now that are culturally sensitive except in the strangest of circumstances. And hopefully when items like that are acquired, all of the stakeholders are contacted and there's a lot of communication about what's being done. And so it's unlikely that you're going to be bringing in a number of sensitive objects into the museum now. But that wasn't always the case. So what's more common is that you have culturally sensitive items that are within your museum that were collected decades or hundreds of years ago, and now you're trying to deal with sort of the backlash of having those items. So NAGPRA is one set of laws that has been enacted to try to remedy wrongs that were done in the past. So the NAGPRA Act it stands for Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So this was passed in 1990, but it didn't actually go into effect until about 1996. And it covers human remains, of which there used to be a lot, funerary objects. So these are objects that are used in culturally important rituals or ceremonies, often with death rites involved. Sacred objects, which are part of the traditional practices that may still be used if those particular cultures are still in existence. And then objects of cultural patrimony. So these are items of ongoing cultural significance. So they may not necessarily be used in like sacred rites, but maybe they're very important to the culture of a particular group. So originally when this act was passed, the way it was supposed to work was that now this is only in the U.S., museums were expected to inventory all of their items that fell under this umbrella, these kinds of items. They were intended to send the inventory to the federal government, And then by 1996, they were expected to start pulling those materials together and then sending them back to the place of origin. So wherever they came from, or to the tribe of origin. Now, this created a lot of acrimony in the community, the museum community, because many people's research careers were built upon these collections. And so to have them taken away meant that you took away their research programs, and it wasn't exactly possible for them to just switch to studying something else. Nevertheless, this is what the Native Americans were able to negotiate with the government, and this bill was able to pass because of so many wrongs that had been done to Native Americans throughout this country. And I talked a little bit in class about the problem with having any of these items that are not culturally affiliated. So it's not clear what tribe they came from, or maybe what area they came from. And those are still a problem today. So those items are not covered under NAGPRA, and it becomes quite difficult and culturally sensitive for those institutions that have them. So there are a lot of Native American tribes that are well aware of the collections that exist in certain museums, and they often press those institutions to repatriate them. But legally, there's actually no vehicle for those institutions to do that because there's no process. That's not covered by the law. Now, we were able to overcome that several years ago by working with an organization in Michigan that's uh, um, a collaboration among several tribes here in Michigan. And so the items that we have, we knew the area that they came from, but it wasn't clear what tribe they were affiliated with. But we were able to work out a situation where, in a process where that coalition of tribes said that they would accept those items and they wanted to repatriate them and rebury them in a sacred ceremony. And so we literally had to apply to the government to ask if this would be an acceptable arrangement. And after a lot of legal wrangling and broadcasting to the nation that we were going to do that. So if any other Native American tribe wanted to make the case that they should get the items, they had an opportunity to do that. And that could have happened. There could have been another tribe that made the claim that no, I don't think you should send those items to that coalition here. Maybe they should go someplace else. But no one objected. And because no one objected, what we did was we had a ceremony where we repatriated those objects right here in town. And I'll tell you more about that in lecture on Monday. But my point is that there's a whole set of laws regarding how Native American items are meant to be handled and treated. But there is a loophole in there where if the objects are unaffiliated, you have a problem legally with how to deal with those objects. Okay. There's also other sort of collection-specific issues. So how do you deal with wildlife specimens? So, of course, you're probably well aware of the Endangered Species Act. So this protects all plants and animals that are threatened or endangered. But this only covers species in the U.S. And so if you are wanting to work on them or collect them, generally speaking, you're prevented from doing that except in extreme circumstances, and you have to make the case for why the federal government should allow you to do this. And most of the time they don't let you do this, but in certain special circumstances they might. By the way, I should probably be clear that it protects you from... it protects the animals that are threatened or endangered, not only from being handled, not only from being collected, but from being handled. So you're usually not even allowed to touch the animals without prior permission. Another issue that you may want to be familiar with if you're involved in natural history collections is CITES. So this is the Convention of on International Trade in Endangered Species. So this is the international agreement for dealing with threatened or endangered species internationally. There's also the Lacey Act. So the Lacey Act amendments of 1981 protects all U.S. flora and fauna from sale, acquisition, importation, and exportation if local, state, and federal laws are violated. And by the way, this just got really interesting. We'll talk about this in class, but there's now an international law that's just gone through that the U.S. did not sign on to. So the Kyoto Treaty, we didn't sign on to this, but lots of other countries around the world did. And this has major impacts for museum work and is a major problem. And I'll talk about this more in class. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about here for today. Be sure and check out the quiz online and be prepared to cover these materials in class. See you on Monday.